You're watching City Channel 4, your window to our community.
You all probably know John Spencer already, professor of psychology and director of the Child's Neuroimaging Facility, as well as the founding director of the Delta Center, with whom the Obermann Center is delighted to partner. John works on the development of working memory, attention and control, spatial cognition, spatial language, dynamic systems, and network models of cognition and action. And his work is especially exciting to a lot of us because of his interest in what he'll talk about today, civic science, which is about putting the University of Iowa on the map in all sorts of ways. And John, one of his early ventures in civic science was a summer seminar he ran here at the Obermann Center that involved more people than we had ever seen at once in a summer seminar. And so I'm sure he'll tell you about that today as he talks about civic science, reframing the role of science in society. Thanks, John.
All right, thanks. It's a nice, cozy room. It's cold out, so we're all warm. So hopefully you won't fall asleep. But I'd like to have actually a conversation today rather than just me blathering on. So I prepared kind of a short presentation at the front end to give you kind of a survey of the ideas. Feel free to interrupt me. Feel like I have to get through the presentation before you ask questions. And then hopefully toward the end, I've come up with a list of what I think are some critical challenges that we're working on within our kind of civic science group. And it would be great to have you folks help us think through how to overcome these challenges together. So, as I begin, I have a number of collaborators listed here. These were all the co-PIs on a workshop that was held at the National Science Foundation at the beginning of October. So I want to kind of acknowledge my collaborators. We also have a kind of a larger group of collaborators that I didn't list because it would be kind of too many people, but just want to acknowledge these folks in particular, and then also we've received generous funding from these different organizations, including the University of Iowa. So in particular, I want to thank Dan Reed for being supportive of the Civic Science Initiative thus far. All right, what I wanted to do today is first tell you my perspective on what civic science is all about, tell you why I've engaged in this initiative, give you a little flavor of one of our case study initiatives that's called Get Ready Iowa, which is a Delta Center initiative in partnership with a number of community partners around early learning and school readiness. Tell you a little bit about the NSF workshop that I mentioned that was held in early October, and then maybe point a trajectory toward where we're moving in the next couple steps. So let me first give you a little bit of context for where the civic science concepts emerged. And we're going to start with the big picture, which is democracy. So obviously a democratic society requires a democratic people with habits, knowledge, and dispositions to work together across differences, address common challenges, and to negotiate a shared way of life. That's the heart of what a democracy is all about. Today, as challenges are multiplying, you can see all around us democratic capacities are diminishing, and the Civic Science Initiative was sort of born out of this tension that we need a new way of doing business and developing ourselves as heirs and architects of the great word democracy. Now, democracy and science actually have a long history together. Science was once widely understood as a wellspring of democratic energy and practices. Today, obviously, science, is booming, but it's not necessarily booming in terms of its democratic practices, right? So science is generating an explosive increase in knowledge, but the democratic energies and practices of science have receded from view. It's become professionalized, right? Science is something that's done in laboratories by professionals, by experts, right? The sense of science being deeply connected and interwoven with democracy has largely disappeared from the public discussion. In parallel with that change in how science and democracy are viewed, society has also changed in its concept of democracy and how democracy is practiced, right? So today we're beset by knowledge wars, where experts and counter-experts are arguing past each other. Politics has become bitterly polarized, as we know. There's a general sense in this country that people have become powerless, right? And there's a huge skepticism about civic institutions. That includes professional institutions and science in general. So in this context, we're in danger of becoming a nation of democracy's spectators, not democracy's co-creators. And the emphasis there is on democracy in a more historical context was not just about voting, right? Democracy was about citizens engaging together to solve problems. So civic science is a framework and a set of democratic and scientific practices that offers opportunities for people to develop their capacity to work across differences, building respect, common resources, and a democratic way of life. And we think this can have far-reaching influences. So the practices of science have deep cultural and political significance when they become part of society rather than just the realm of professionals. So we think civic science is a real opportunity. It represents a commitment to develop democratic practices in all citizens and to interweave them with multiple ways of knowing. Okay, so that's sort of the context in which these ideas emerged. Now I want to turn to what are the sort of central concepts of civic science. And the first one is rather contentious, that science is political. We often think about science as being objective. We're supposed to be removed from politics in our laboratories. And I'm not saying that science does not have to move away from things like replication, right, and objectivity. Those are important components of the methods of science, right? Science thrives, and why it's such a tool of discovering new knowledge is because of that sense of objectivity, right, that we can replicate things over and over again. But what we've lost is a sense that science is political in the kind of older sense of politics, that politics is really about how humans interact with each other, right? It's not about partisan politics. It doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican or independent, right? Politics is infused in a democratic society. It's how we all get along with each other. In that context, or that sense of politics, right, we could say that science is of the people, right? One of the main things we do with science is have it impact our society, right? We use that knowledge to do things, right? It also shapes how we interact, right? You reach into your pocket and you got your iPhone as a great example of transforming our society and how we interact with each other in now virtual communities rather than face-to-face communities. And then it's a source of knowledge and power in the world. Okay, now if you acknowledge the political sense of science, you also have to acknowledge the limitations of science within that political arena. Okay, so science rarely provides crisp solutions for how we should actually engage with one another, right? That's particularly true if you think about the grand challenges facing society today, like climate change or sustainability, challenges in health, and the one we focused on here in Iowa, poverty and the achievement gap. Okay? In all of these cases, science doesn't provide the answers, right? It provides a lot of really important information for us, right? But we cannot solve climate change through science alone, right? That requires democracy. That requires people taking that knowledge and power from science and doing stuff with it in the real world. Now, we can also think about what's a goal when we combine or think about science and politics together. And one of the goals we've been focused on is how do you create sustainable solutions to things like grand challenges of climate change, right? And one of the key concepts that has actually emerged in the scientific literature is the concept of agency. Okay, so that In order to create sustainable solutions to complex problems, the most effective change comes when communities change from within. Okay? In particular, when those communities have agency around the solutions you're trying to create. This comes from one great example, the work of Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, who did a lot of work in looking at sustainable solutions to challenges in low resource settings like in Africa. And her research shows that when communities change from within, when people have buy-in to those solutions, when they help create the solutions themselves, even when the experts leave, even when the resources leave, the solutions are sustained. Okay. Her work also shows that sustained solutions only happen when scientists work together with citizens as citizens to co-create that change. Okay. So when we level the playing field, when we're not talking about experts and consumers of that expert knowledge, but we talk about co-creators, we're all citizens together trying to find solutions together, right? That does a lot of things. It establishes trust, it establishes buy-in, and I would argue it actually generates better science. Okay. A lot of the insights we get as scientists, some of them come from the lab, but some of them come from getting out and talking to people, right, and picking up on their own expert knowledge from living in that community. And so when we flatten those conversations, when we're open to multiple ways of knowing, just simply open to input from the community, I think we do better science. Okay. Now, if our goal is to create sustainable solutions to grand challenges by combining science and civic agency, we could say, how on earth are we going to do this? And here's where we've turned to another, actually, scholarly community, which is a emerging civic studies field. Okay, so there's a growing movement within science and technology studies and political theory that's cohered around this concept of civic studies to look at what are the sort of habits and practices that promote democracy, that promote interaction, that promote people working together across differences to create solutions. So I've just listed a few of those practices here. Some of the ideas we're working with come from community organizing, forming one-on-one relationships, right? Doing things like mapping out the power in a community, where are the resources, how can we leverage those resources into solutions, and I think a really important concept of self-interest, right? This is not being egotistical. This is saying, if I'm going to devote my time and energy into a solution or into changing my community, what motivates that? I got to care about something. I've got to be emotionally motivated to get involved. And that's the concept of self-interest. What's in it for me is an important question to ask if you're going to actually devote your time and energies into something. So kind of putting these ideas together, I'd say civic science is a set of democratic practices and a way of doing innovative science that seeks to create a more vibrant democracy and also solutions to the grand challenges of our day. Okay, so what I want to move into next is to sort of make this a little bit more personal. So that's our definition of the concepts, but address the question, what on earth am I doing engaging in civic science? And for me, actually, this is a tough question. So Teresa mentioned all these things I study in the introduction, and I'm really going to talk about none of them today. And that is actually a message to you that my life is somewhat disconnected. So when I actually started, this is a kind of honest confession, when I started engaging in civic science work, my hope was that it would be done sort of in a public scholarship model, right? That I would engage with communities and I'd get stuff back and it would change my science. And the problem, I think there's actually a problem with that perspective, in that I do laboratory science. I do neuroimaging with kids and adults in artificial laboratory tasks and highly controlled experiments, right? And I've realized over time that in terms of my actual science, that hasn't changed, right? The questions I'm asking really haven't changed. All this community work hasn't changed that stuff that I do in my lab. Now, I will say it has changed my perspective, and I'm hoping over time, maybe I'll start to do slightly different experiments and maybe broaden the scope. But it has not been a slam dunk case for public engagement or public scholarship. And I mention that because one of the challenges I'm going to raise at the very end is I think for us to do things like big picture, foster democracy, right, and change the way science is viewed en masse, we can't just have applied scientists doing civic science. We need to get basic scientists engaged as citizens out there in the world. And that's going to be one of my big take-home challenges is how do we get, the bench scientists to engage in this stuff? And that involves trying to figure out what their self-interest is. So this is my story about what my self-interest is, I guess. So here's my self-interest. My kids. I'm a developmental scientist. As I said, I study a lot about how the brain develops. Very passionate about my own kids, and that also that passion infuses my work as a scientist. So I study development from a systems perspective. We can think about, when we talk about a systems perspective, we think about, all the influences shaping development from the genetic to the neurocognitive to the behavioral to the social environmental. And we think about that complex system changing over multiple time scales from in the moment behavior, right, which I might study, in a neuroimaging lab, watching how the brain, changes dynamically as kids engage in different tasks. And then I might ask them to learn something and watch how their brain changes as they learn, right? And then over a longer time scale of development, I might track those kids individually from year to year to year and watch their brain transform and their behavior transform. So, this is how, as dry as it is, this is how I think about kids, right? So I should go back. These are real interesting, cute kids. These are my dull, boring laboratory kids. Okay. Now, if I think about development this way, I'm instantly thrust into the world that I call complex systems, right? If I want to have an impact on a kid's life and a system as complicated as this, how do I do it, right? If I'm interested in something that I study, working memory, it's very important for development. Kids with we know, younger children who have better working memory skills, even at 12 months, predicts their performance in school at 11 years. Okay. Other aspects of development that I study, like executive function, which is kind of your higher level ability to control how you behave. Like for kids, knowing that when I'm in circle time and the teacher's reading, I'm supposed to attend to her, and if I want to ask a question, I raise my hand. All right, that's one set of rules. Very different set of rules at recess, very different set of rules in the lunchroom. And executive function is kind of how I modulate my behavior from situation to situation, right? That stuff, I can measure executive function at 3 to 4 years, and it actually predicts adult outcomes, right, several decades later. It predicts, criminality several decades later. It predicts your health. It predicts your marital satisfaction, right? So pretty cool stuff. If I could affect working memory at 12 months or executive function at 3 years, awesome, right? We could have major impacts on development. But how the heck do I do that in this complicated system? So that's kind of the problem that I've been grappling with. And, to change something like working memory or executive function in a system like this requires really deeply thinking about that system and how that system around the child functions. And this is sort of the picture I've come up with to describe that world. And there are many stakeholders in the child's world, right? You've got parents over there, right? Directly connected to the kids, deeply concerned about the kids. You got teachers, also very connected to the kids. As you move out, you start to get into a world that's less connected to that child, but it's still very influential on the child's life. You've got administrators and principals. And then you get into the scientific world over here with outcome researchers studying how classrooms are structured or what's the best curricula, right? And applied researchers designing new curricula or new tools, maybe to enhance working memory or whatever, right? And then way over here is me, the basic researcher doing, these artificial tasks in the laboratory. And we also sort of embed this in an entire community. Community partners, like we partner a lot with the Iowa Children's Museum, right? Great place to kind of play around with ideas, right? And a great place for kids to just have fun and learn. And when I kind of think about all these different worlds that impact a child's life, what I see is a lot of specialization and a lack of coordination and a lot of disconnection. And that's been borne out in some of the community engagement work that the Delta Center has done. It is absolutely the case that there's many, many resources out there that impact a child's life, but they are very, very disconnected from one another. So this is what I think of as the world as it should be, right? Where we're basically going to compress all that down. We're going to think about individual people forming one-on-one relationships with each other, right? And developing agency, right? Realizing that we all have the capacity to change that child's life. This kind of vision became very personal for me when I was at invited to go to a workshop. Was on early childhood education. It was nearby. I'm not even, I don't even remember anymore why. I think, it was one of those pamphlets that, they sent to all the professors. And I got one, but I was like, oh, this looks kind of interesting. It's just up the road. So I went, and I was total outsider because it was all about, outcome research and very education focused, which is not what I really do. But I wanted to just sort of survey what that world was like and this sort of state of the art. And what was interesting for me is I went talk after talk on, different approaches to education and different, tools and curricular tools and whether they were effective or not. And one question never came up in the entire day, which was how do kids learn and how do kids develop? Right? It's very focused on, let's come up with this tool based on whatever principles, and let's see if it works. And let's try this tool and see if it works. And let's try this tool and see if it works. And so I was at at the coffee hour, just hanging out like a sore thumb because I didn't bring anybody with me, and stupidly. And I'm sitting there sipping my coffee, and a guy comes up and starts talking to me, and it turns out he was a representative of a parent group for kids with disabilities. And so he was there trying to see, basically just representing his group, trying to find out, what are the new innovative things that are coming up in the early education system. And I asked him, I said, one of the things that's kind of surprising is I haven't heard anybody really talk about learning and development. So how do you think about development? I asked him. And he said, no one's ever asked me that question. And I said, oh, okay, well, tell me, how do you think about development? And he told me about his daughter with special needs. I think she had cerebral palsy, and the challenges of interacting with her, especially early in development, and trying to work with physical therapists on motor development and things like that. And what was really cool is he had a very deep sense of sort of how development builds step by step, how, a little smile on his daughter's part got him into a particular interaction with her, and, actually started to teach her how to crawl a little bit better, or motivate her to walk just a little bit more, right? And it was all about these little details of development. I was like, aha, that's what I study, right? That's really cool. You're right. That's exactly how development works. Step by step by step, little interaction by little interaction. So I felt like this parent knows more about development than all these professionals that are talking about, education and curriculum. And that's not fair, of course, but really insightful. So that, so the idea is, boy, if we could get people talking directly to one another, new insights would come out. And boy, if that parent and I could walk away with some agency that we could have an impact on children's lives, that'd be really powerful. But of course, that's not enough, right? Individuals forming relationships is one thing, but that's not going to change something like school readiness in the state of Iowa, right? So what we need is another layer to think about coordinated agency. how different groups of people forming relationships, being innovative, developing their agency, how they all coordinate, right? And I now think of democracy as coordinated agency, right? That we all have the power to change stuff, to work together, to innovate. And boy, if we could coordinate all that stuff, that could be transformative. So that's kind of how I go from, my own work in the laboratory and how I think about development to something like civic science. Because, again, to go back, and if I want to change the working memory of a child or the executive function of a child, because I know that's predictive, I can't do it alone. I've got to think about the whole context to which the child's developing. And I think the only way to change that system is through a view like this, right? We're not going to do it in a top-down, scientists have the answer, you guys just do this and it'll work. It's got to develop in a much more agency-based way, communities changing themselves. Okay, so that leads to this project from the Delta Center, which was launched through an Obermann Summer Seminar. And I liked what Teresa said about that we had never had so many people together, which is just how naive and dumb I am, right? We talked about an Obermann Summer Seminar. I was like, oh, okay, let's do this, big, huge thing, get all these people together and, go change the landscape of early learning. And she was like, well, we usually have, this many people get in. So I thank you very much for both supporting it and also tolerating me. What we did when we launched this was actually, this is a good indicator of how disconnected the worlds of early learning were, or maybe still are, right? We brought in a bunch of experts on early learning and development, on a range of topics, really. We had people here who were, studied things like executive function, like I told you about, but we also had someone who works with Sesame Street, right, and talked about, kids media. We had folks who were doing community-based early learning programs, folks in the universal pre-K world, right? We got all these people together, and we invited everyone from parents, to teachers, to administrators, to scientists, right, all the way up, all different groups. And people came, to their credit, which was great. But at the end of a 2-day seminar, they said, wow, this is so great to get all these different groups together, which told us, I was like, okay, yeah, we're doing something different here. And then what we did is on Saturday, we got a smaller group together, and it was a day-long exercise of starting to form relationships, trying to get people to say, would you buy into the idea of working together, scientists, citizens, together as citizens, and let's transform the landscape of early learning in this state, right? And we had one-on-one discussions, and at one point, so my colleague Harry Boyd he was active in the civil rights movement, and which it never dawned on me that civil rights could mean more than just civil rights, but it's extremely relevant today how that transformation happened, and to have people who lived through that say, like I was just talking to at the NSF workshop, guy Gerald Taylor, who's a national community organizer, and he lived through civil rights and was a community organizer in the civil rights movement. And he told me, we're talking about Get Ready Iowa, and we're going to transform, early education in the state. And he said, great, And I said, yeah, it's great, but it's overwhelming, right? How could you possibly do that? And he said, the funny thing is, when we were going through the civil rights movement, we had no idea we could transform the nation that quickly. We had, certainly we were invested in the idea. We were deeply committed, but, it was basically, they were all just doing their local thing, trying to have those conversations in the barbershops, in the churches, and really try to just transform each community, one community at a time. And they thought, okay, maybe gradually it would start to take hold. And then it took off like wildfire. And that was extremely reassuring for me, right, to realize that one of the most important historical moments in our country. The people driving the bus didn't necessarily think they could do it, right? It happened one community at a time and then caught like wildfire. So we launched Get Ready Iowa at the Obermann Summer Seminar, and we've been active as a group for the last several years. So that was in 2012, so we're coming up on 2.5 years. Established lots of community partnerships. I've got some of the community member or partner groups down here. The Delta Center, Iowa City School District, 4Cs is a community child care organization, Johnson County Empowerment, Iowa Academy of Pediatrics, Iowa AEYC, et cetera. And what we're trying to tackle is pretty scary data that 35 to 5% of children in the U.S. are unprepared to succeed in school. And countering that is great evidence that early intervention with kids can have a profound impact on that statistic. Okay, so what Get Ready Iowa is all about is to enhance the school readiness of children in Iowa by bringing scientists together with citizens as citizens to change the ecology of early learning. Our goal is to empower communities to change from within by creating impactful programs and strong partnerships. And we've launched a number of different initiatives, which I'd be happy to tell you about, but I wasn't really going to go into the details here. I think the most important thing for me about Get Ready Iowa is we had a great launch. We followed it up with lots of effort in forming relationships. And those relationships have held the group together. And I think we just had a meeting at the end of October, which we called sort of launching Get Ready Iowa 2.0, right? Essentially taking this initiative, now that we form relationships, to the next level and trying to have an impact statewide instead of just in our community, trying to focus around a common vision and create, sort of take our experiences with these impactful programs and take them to scale. So again, I'd be happy to tell you about that, but more about that. But what I thought I'd do is just give you a little snapshot of this workshop at the National Science Foundation, set up a few challenges, and then maybe we can have a discussion, since no one's interrupted me yet. Okay. So this workshop was partially funded by the National Science Foundation and the other organizations I listed at the beginning. So we met in Washington, D.C. I just realized I have a great. It was really cool because we're at the National Science Foundation, like the temple of science, right? And they had this. It was in many ways a great room, nice windows and everything, but it was divided into two parts, and right in the middle was this huge podium, right? This is National Science Foundation with flags behind it, right? So we all took turns posing behind the very powerful-looking podium. And I should have put that in the slides, but I didn't. So the goals of the workshop were to formalize our vision of civic science, also work on what are the methods or practices of civic science, talk about case studies or model examples, and emerging solutions within different domains. We focused in on early learning, which was our Get Ready Iowa project. We've got a bunch of partners working on sustainable agriculture, another group working on climate change and climate science, and then a fourth group working on health and communities, doing some very innovative work around community health in the areas of diabetes was one example. And then to develop strategies to impact policy and to change the national conversation about the role of science in society. That, just a modest goal there. Okay, these are our organizing questions just to give you a sense of how we set the workshop up. What is civic science, right? So that was kind of some of the content I took you through at the beginning. In what ways does civic science reflect a break from business as usual in science, and how science intersects with society? What are the tools or practices of civic science? What are the barriers to civic science? And how can we make civic science more effective? Just to give you a kind of a flavor, I looked through my notes and found a slide that we had sort of made on the fly, and those are often the best take-home messages from a workshop, the things you kind of co-create on the fly in the moment, and it turned out it did a nice job of summarizing the discussion. So kind of two key questions we focused in on at different parts during the workshop. First, what is civic science? And this is just the list the whole group came up with. Okay. Civic science is multi-directional and inclusive, open to multiple ways of knowing, scientist as a citizen, address complex problems that require long-range, big-scale solutions, accelerate the pace of innovation and action, brings together basic and applied sciences. Maybe this needs some explanation. Top-down and bottom-up, arranged horizontally. Okay, that's groupthink right there, right? You would never ever write that sentence except as a group. So what people meant by that, the top-down part was that, let's say if we're going to address something as complex as climate change or as complex as early learning, solutions aren't just going to come from the community up. Sometimes we have to think about, what's the state of the scientific knowledge, and maybe take our survey of the scientific literature and actually say, hey, look at these data, we should cohere around this theme, right? And so that was the sense of top-down. The sense of bottom-up was then, you could then take that theme and change it and tweak it based on knowledge in the community, based on how the community actually views that particular perspective. And that's where the arranged horizontally comes from. It's not like the, hey, look at this theme we should cohere around takes precedent because it comes from science. And the community innovation gets demoted because it comes from the community. So instead of having top down and bottom up, we want to arrange it horizontally. So it's a mutual interaction between different communities or different groups. So that's what that was trying to capture. And then the last one actually points toward a challenge I'm going to raise in a few moments, which is engagement with humanities. And lots of discussion at the workshop about how the humanities might help clarify the why of civic science, why this is so important. Why is it that this type of innovative science might have an impact about how we think of ourselves in a democratic society or as citizens in a democratic society. So that led to a discussion of why civic science. There we talked about multiple ways of knowing can create barriers between groups, right? And also create barriers in the ability of science to inform policy and politics. So at this intersection, we're trying to take kind of data and knowledge and bring it into the political sphere. There's lots of barriers that get set up, both in terms of how we think about objective science, and you shouldn't even be part of the conversation, right? But also in, you scientists just want to be the experts and have the entire say, and you're discounting my perspective on the situation. So those barriers get set up, and we need a framework for breaking them down. We need to address the mindsets of how people think about science and how science and policy come together, kind of a related theme. Talked a lot about how democracy and science are deeply connected through the concepts of equality and freedom. Okay. So, at the heart of science is a beautiful notion of replication, right? That I don't care who you are, if you have the right methods, right, and you should be able to replicate any finding in the literature, right? That's universal. That's democracy, right? Doesn't matter who you are. Everybody's equal, right? So that's a deep scientific concept, deeply connected to democracy. So we talked a lot about equality and freedom and how civic science might help foster freedom in a democracy and maybe help foster democracy itself. And then another why is, of course, better science and actually coming up with solutions for wicked problems, which was our tag for problems that emerge in these grand challenge areas. Another concept that was developed at the workshop that we're developing even more is, this was a slide that came from Peter Levine at Tufts, who's living in the civic studies world. And a lot of people kind of resonated with this perspective of how civic science connects up three often distinctive worlds. The world of democracy, right, at the highest level, governance by and for the people who are reasonably equal. You can see the civic studies. There's a person, a scholar in this field cannot say we're all equal. We're reasonably equal. Thought that was interesting wording. There's the civic, which is the work of citizens, who are moral agents. As a citizen, I interact with you to decide what we should do, then act and reflect on the experience. This requires not just individual virtues and practices, but also appropriate settings and institutions. And then we've got science over there. And in this Venn diagram, when Peter presented this, he talked about, there are different places where the civic world and democracy intersect that don't really involve science, places where democracy and science intersect that don't involve the civic world. And he emphasized that he thinks civic science lives right at the intersection of all three. Okay? And that was, again, just an interesting perspective that emerged from the workshop. Okay, so where is civic science now? We're forming a leadership group, and we're going to have our next meeting in January in Ames, Iowa. We're going to Ames because it's so beautiful in January. But also one of the themes that we explored at the workshop was that civic science might be a great framework for the cooperative extension system. So if you look at the history of cooperative extension, there's a long history there of thinking about how professionals and universities interact with citizens, right, in a democratic society. And so civic science is essentially could be a nice framework to revitalize the democratic traditions of cooperative extension. Kath Ann Kress, who's the VP for Outreach and Extension at Iowa State, was taken with that idea, and so she's taken it upon herself to bring this leadership group to Ames to explore that concept. We're also continuing to develop case study projects like Get Ready Iowa. We came out of the workshop with a sharper sense of what civic science is, but we still feel like we need to distill it in a way that is easier to convey and maybe also create, in some contexts, sharper distinctions with other approaches to science. We spent a lot of time talking about community-based mental health, for example, or community-based participatory research, and how civic science might differ from community-based participatory research. And then we're developing essentially a national agenda for how can we do civic organizing around civic science. And our target is actually to be ready for the 2016 presidential election and to inject things like climate change and early learning into that presidential election. In terms of challenges ahead, we're sort of operating at two levels in the civic science initiative, at the level of civic science as a democratic movement and civic science as an innovative approach to grand challenges in specific areas. So we're sort of balancing specific science, right, and community science partnerships to generate solutions around climate change in one hand or early learning in the other. And that's sort of a different conversation when you talk about a specific problem versus you talk about democracy in general. So we're trying to figure out how do we navigate from that more abstract conversation to the more specific applications of civic science. As I alluded to earlier, I think a fundamental challenge is to bring more basic scientists into the mix, right? And my favorite example is, why would a particle physicist ever engage in civic science, right? Or an astrophysicist or a molecular biologist? What's their self-interest and why should they be motivated to engage with citizens, right, around things like democracy? I wrote an essay on civic science, and the best idea I've come up with is if you're a particle physicist or a molecular biologist, one of the things you're feeling today in science is an attack on science as a whole Funding is going down. Trust in science is going down, right? And one of the things we take for granted as scientists is our freedom of inquiry, right? That is a gift of a democracy, that we can have scientists, that I can sit in my office and think stuff up, right? That's a huge gift. That intellectual freedom needs to be protected, and I personally think it's under attack. And if that does not get basic scientists off their ass and into the conversation, I'm not sure what will. And then I think a real challenge is to integrate civic scientists with scholars in the arts and humanities. As I said, they can help provide the why of civic science, and that's why I'm really happy to have Scott Peters as a partner in this project. Scott brings in the entire organization of Imagining America, and he's very interested in how arts, humanities, and science can kind of co-conspire to foster democracy and co-create solutions to grand challenges. And that's all I have prepared. So, yeah.
I have a highly skeptical question.
Great.
So you're talking about two things that stand out to me. First, that the intellectual freedom to question a scientist is a core sort of democratic principle, or not democratic principle, but it inherently has democratic principles in it.
Right.
I completely agree. I also noticed the discussion of the way that science can bring so much to the table as far as those discoveries lead. But in thinking about kind of the big umbrella issues, talking about the NSF, thinking about sort of the attack on the NSF that's happening right now from its oversight committee, so to speak,
Yeah.
and thinking about that process of questioning another scientist. And what the NSF does is it gives money to science to continue making discoveries. But we've really moved away from questioning other people's discoveries or giving money to scientists to redo other people's experiments. There's this huge pressure on doing something new that people are not, there's no incentive to go back and redo what somebody else has already done. How do you bring that democracy back? Because that seems like it's at the core of this, that if you just think science can move us forward, we just need to keep progressing to come up with these answers to help, for example, early learners. It seems to me like there's a fundamental kind of like, if you can't solve this basic problem within the scientific community, how can the scientific community really generate true democracy or improve democracy when it seems so money based in this, like, how do you get funding, and you can't redo somebody else's experiment because you can't get funding to do it, and the NSF seems to be a big player in that.
Okay, so there were a lot of things there.
Sorry about that. It's been cooking for a while.
Yeah. Okay, so let me start with the kind of funding climate and the issue that you accurately raised, which is a move toward we need a faster pace of discovery, we need greater innovation, we need to make greater headway on both basic and applied sciences rather than spending our time moving so systematically, replicating previous results and then extending them to create, that unified theory of everything, right? So that's absolutely a fundamental tension in science. And I, in a weird way, think that civic science helps with all that. So first, it can help lend a bit of realism to the scientific enterprise. Okay, so as we're pushing for innovation and discovery and a faster pace of discovery, the rush there and the implication is that science is going to provide the answers. And I think that's true in some contexts. We're certainly on the cusp of cures for some medical diseases and things like that. Fantastic, right? That's a great investment. And there should be a rush to innovate in those areas. When we think about something like climate science, or when we think about early learning, I think we actually know quite a bit right now about what things could be impactful, and what we lack is the political will and the sort of that cooperative agency to turn those kernels of ideas into reality. And so that sort of frees you up a little bit as a scientist to say, because like it's very interesting. I was talking to someone at the workshop, not someone. I was talking to the former head of in the Obama administration of the climate science. So it wasn't a small potatoes person. And when you are Obama's chief climate scientist, right, you have to be very careful about what you say with regard to climate science. Okay? And I was telling her, well, since I'm not Obama's chief scientist on early learning, and I'm actually a basic researcher doing stuff far removed from the classroom in my lab, that actually frees me up quite a bit to be more of a citizen, right? I'm still a scientist, and I bring, my knowledge of complex systems and development to bear in the real world, but it frees me up a little bit. And I think that's good, because I can then say as a scientist, look, we have to be realistic about the state of scientific knowledge and what we can prove or disprove, right? And instead, let's try to innovate together and make headway on this problem. And even to the point where, we've had discussions in Get Ready Iowa about, if we start to develop innovative solutions that are based on science, should we then do a randomized control trial, blah, 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 right? And we're kind of like, no, if it's starting to work, maybe we're good with that. Maybe we don't always have to understand exactly why it works. If we can trace the history from this scientific idea to this innovative solution and how it got tweaked by this community and then implemented in this particular way, and it feels, it's impactful. We want to measure the impact, of course. But that may be that's actually a pretty fast pace of discovery if we can get there. So I think there are these inherent tensions caused by, on one hand, we have big problems and we need to solve them, and boy, science, come along and fix them for us. I think that's the wrong perspective. And that is, I think, in part driving the move toward innovation and fast pace at things at NSF and NIH, right? They're just getting blowback from the community that you're not solving our problems fast enough. Whereas if we change the frame and we say, that's not actually our job to solve problems, right? Those problems are too complex to really solve in detail in the way you're thinking. Instead, we have some ideas about what could work. You have knowledge of your community. Let's work together and try to solve these things together rather than, expert and consumers. So, how's that for a response? I'm not sure I hit every theme in there, but
that's okay.
Yeah, okay.
Anybody else have questions? Okay. Well, actually, I have one too. I know that I don't know if it's NSF, but that a number of these large granting organizations are now asking for social impacts when you apply for the grant. And I've wondered exactly what that means and whether civic science is one response, a possible response to that demand.
Yeah, so and you're referring to the broader impacts, right? Yeah, that's what, yeah. So every grant submitted to NSF has to address intellectual merit and broader impacts. And a lot of scientists used to think broader impacts were, I educate my students, right? And and I educate my students. That was pretty much the broader impact. And I influence my colleagues in the scientific discipline, right? That's broader impact. And then as NSF has, I think, importantly, placed more emphasis on broader impacts, they've actually clarified that what they mean is beyond the scientific discipline. How is your work connecting up somehow to the larger public? They have systematically taken that more and more seriously, and I do think that civic science provides potential framing for that broader impacts. certainly provides lots of nice examples, right? And in fact, some of the projects I had listed for the Get Ready Iowa project as our initiatives, some of those were actually funded by broader impacts off my INSF grants, right? Because one of the things you can do is you can write in money. I write in money to my NSF grant and, give me $5,000 to $10,000 to do this partnership with the Iowa Children's Museum to create an exhibit on brains under construction, as an example. And one of the limitations of broader impacts that NSF has identified is that they are impact in the community, but they're not sustained, right? They're little one-off projects that individual scientists are doing. And that's where I think civic science could be particularly useful, because if you can connect up with a larger initiative and be sort of one smaller piece of the puzzle, that broader impact could have legs in the future, right? It can be sustained by the larger group. And so that's one of the, let's say models we've been thinking of in the Delta Center of how, could we have, all of our investigators applying for these different NSF grants have sort of shared broader impacts, right? Could they all connect to Get Ready Iowa, for example? And then, 5K here and 10K here and another 5K here and this initiative and that initiative. And now it starts to add up and it's sustainable because you've got a large collection of researchers all moving in the same direction. So that's hard to sort of formalize at the level of NSF, right? It's easier to do at the level of like a center. So I think there's interesting territory that could be explored there.
Why don't you introduce yourselves too when you... Sure.
Yeah.
I'm Frank Solomon, and I have the enormous pleasure of being a fellow here at Obermann. This fascinating talk with its fascinating optimism reminded me of an experience with a doctoral candidate in anthropology who studied, looking back on it, what seems to me a very good example of your goals, and that's an organization called Trout Streams Unlimited. Perhaps you know it.
It sounds familiar, actually.
Yeah. It worked very well in organizing the enormous stakeholder public of people who like fishing, together with fundamental science about water and applied science about water resources, right. Economics, and
yep.
even politicians.
Yeah.
Everybody loves trout, but I don't know that many people who love quarks. So I wonder how one goes about developing that effect of coalitions around particular values when it deals with some of the less tangible parts of science.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, in some ways, that's a fundamental tension about these basic scientists, too, right? And in part, I think that's reflected in the strategic move of the civic science group to focus in on grand challenges, because we can all agree in these grand challenges areas that we're not making progress, right? And so the idea is these are fundamental problems. People care about them, so that's where it's strategic as well. And we think what's needed is exactly the type of thing you described with what was it, trout streams unlimited. I thought I was going to say trout unlimited. I was like, well, that's a bad image, right? Unlimited trout. Yeah. In some ways, I think we have to get the ball rolling, but you're absolutely right. With less sexy domains, right, that people are less intrinsically motivated around, we still want to kind of instill these habits and practices. But at the end of the day, a lot of people have quirky interests, and you'd often be surprised by what people can be passionate about. So I think we're trying to be strategic and focus in on ones that people are, they're big picture, intrinsically motivated, and you can see how all the threads connect to both the need for, local solutions all the way up to the need for better democracy, right? But yeah, you want to apply it more generally than that. So it's a great challenge.
So I found this, I'm David, can you hear me?
Yeah, I think it's for the TV.
Television, not amplification. This is your star moment.
Yeah.
I'm David Depew, I'm an emeritus, also emeritus from Obermann. So I just wondered whether you did in fact look at the long, complicated history of this kind of approach in the United States, and whether or not, if you did, whether you found that inspiring or depressing.
Yeah.
Or whether doing such a thing is worthwhile at all. I mean, this has a long history.
Yeah, it does. And that's where I'm fortunate to have colleagues who are historians, right? So I'm not by any means an expert in the history of, I mean, you're right, there are a lot of concepts here. A lot of my colleagues trace some of these ideas back to Dewey, right? So they've taught me a bit about that history, and maybe that's where the unbridled optimism comes from.
Well, notice that John Dewey was a developmental child psychologist.
Yes.
Like himself.
Yes.
He was a philosopher because philosophy and psychology were not separated
Yeah.
in the United States at the time. Getting through this method of inquiry, this schools sort of worked and sort of didn't.
Yeah.
Because you developed a kind of a split between the populace base and the expertise in education.
Yeah.
And then you had the foundation of the NSF, which had a democratic Dewey progressivist-based model under the direction of a senator named Kilgore.
Yep.
His opponent was Vannevar Bush, who was one of the founders of the connection between science and the Cold War. Bush won. There were some stops for the people, but the original proposal was that the grants for doing science at a national level would be for state and local projects that were relevant to improving the life of those people.
Right.
And presumably, if it had developed, it would have developed along the lines you're talking about.
Yep.
But it developed in a very different way.
Yep. Yep.
And it was enormously successful when it developed. It created a whole class, almost a caste.
Right.
If we didn't marry outside the tribe, we'd be a caste of learners whose relationship to the population is pretty much zero in this respect, unless you operate at a lower level.
Yep.
So that's the depressing side of the story. I'd like to know.
What's
you make me think of the optimistic side.
Yeah.
Of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, all I could say is I'm a ridiculous optimist. And I guess, when you look at these historical threads, and then you look at the current context of, the interface between science and society, it feels like we're on potentially a tipping point. And there are there's certainly lots of resonance with these ideas worldwide. Some of the history you're talking about actually is deeply rooted in the formation of the cooperative extension movement. And I know a lot of folks in cooperative extension, in part, feel like this is sort of just a reframing of the democratic traditions of cooperative extension. But fortunately, they look at that in a positive light, right? You could say, well, how is this different, right? It's a new name, but these ideas have been around for a long time. And I think that's absolutely true. At the same time, while the ideas have been around for a long time, people have not cohered around them effectively. And they've been degraded in context after context. And so, the tension in cooperative extension right now is a lot of people feel they've completely bought into the expert consumer model, right? And that extension is all about delivery of products to the community. And they're like, no, that's not what extension's all about. Extension was supposed to be about living in communities, about being part of communities, about working with the community to create solutions to challenges people are having. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And so they see civic science in a positive light as maybe that can rekindle those democratic traditions and cooperative extension, right? So the same people, like the Dewey folks in education, right, really resonate with this. And at the same time, the democratic traditions in education have degraded. So maybe if we provide a framework, people will come. That's the hope. Yeah.
So I'm Jennifer Masada, and David's question about the history of this makes me think of the old ideas of progress, those that developed during the Industrial Revolution, where progress and the idea of progress was seen to revolutionize life as we know it. And it seems like what you're talking about is a viewpoint, or maybe it's a point at which we find ourselves in our history as humans, where we're pushing and poking and prodding at that old idea of progress. It seems like you're talking about, especially when you talk about agency and the connection of agency to civic science, you're talking about asking how
do I live in
how
the
does
world?
progress look?
Yeah.
Are we redefining that now? Does it look different now? I mean, and this goes back to the questions about the NSF funding and all those models of progress that NSF funding may have been based on. So wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah. I mean,
the
I've
idea
never
of
really thought
progress.
about sort of that concept of progress per se, but certainly the ideas here are embroiled in sort of the times we live in today and the future we envision for ourselves, right? And yeah, so I can definitely see the connection you're making to the concept of progress. A lot of people have pointed to the concept of growth as another fraught metaphor.
Maybe we've
Right.
rounded out that
Yeah.
particular viewpoint.
Yeah, and now, I mean,
Cusp of a big change.
right. And so people now are, talking a lot more about things like sustainability, right? And in the concept of agency also thinks about what's the quality of life of the individual, right? Am I a consumer as an individual, or am I an agent, right? Can I change my world, or do I just take things from my world, right?
It's kind of like the Blue Zones
Yeah.
project, if you've heard of the Blue
Yeah,
Zones.
yeah. Again, another good example of sort of initiative that has this flavor, right? And I mean, again, that's the thing I've been struck by. I described the kind of siloed and uncoordinated nature of the early learning world, right? And I think if you take that to the bigger scale, and you say, what's the connection between the Blue Zones project and the I'm going to go Trout's Unlimited project, because Trout Streams Unlimited, right? What's the connection? And I think there is a connection. It's there's a certain spirit there, there are practices there, and I think what we're trying to do is create a broad umbrella. And that the trick is, of course, and we encountered this at the NSF meeting, was like when we talked about community-based participatory research, right? So. Do you want to say how civic science differs from that? I think that's an important intellectual exercise, right? To sharpen distinctions. At the same time, do you want to also maybe create a broad umbrella where, community-based participatory research could be an example of civic science? I think it is, actually. I think what we were left with after the workshop was that, one distinction point is basic researchers are kind of not really relevant to community-based participatory research, right? They're not actively participating in that model, right? And if you talk about, I'm sure there are examples, but we had a lot of folks who were working in that framework, and I think they at least said, that doesn't really come up as a part of the concept, as a integral theme, right? And I think it has to be integral to civic science, and that's one of my big bugaboos with this approach. I keep harping to my colleagues, we've got to get basic scientists involved. Part of that is, I think, thinking about, one of the key concepts from a community organizing perspective is, where does power lie in the community, right? well, where does power lie in science? There's a lot of power in basic science, right? So I think it's important for that reason. But I think it connects so directly to the concept of democracy and, scientific freedom. And, I just think that's so important to the basic sciences. And I think it's important to a lot of my colleagues too. Now, as a scientist, how can you work on that problem? That's harder, right? What do I do? Okay, I'm inspired by civic science. I want to go protect scientific freedoms. What do I do? Right? That's a hard one. But I'd like to see people thinking about that problem, right? And then, there's a lot of my colleagues in like physics and biology who are doing, they're actually doing quite a bit of work in communities around just basic science education, right? Well, that feels like, good civic science to me. And that, I referred to the public scholarship model earlier, right? That's where I kind of feel that's a nice example of, I don't expect that work on, scientific literacy and scientific education in the community to change what the physicist does in the lab, right? It probably will sharpen how the physicist talks to other people, sharpen concepts of science even, right? So it's going to change how that physicist thinks, may not change what they do in the lab. And that's sort of been, for me, the same type of distinction. It may not change what I do in my lab, but boy, has it changed my perspective on science. Even the questions, broadly speaking, that I'm asking, it's changed those as well. And I write better grants now. I can really sell the community side of my science.
That sounds like a pretty. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, John.
Thanks for questions and for listening.
You're watching City Channel 4. On TV, online, on demand, on Facebook, and now on the go on your mobile device.